Hello, I'm Carter Threlkeld, and welcome to Introduction to Worship. Let's begin today's lesson. Today's lesson is a review of everything that we have studied this semester. And we're going to be talking about 16 historical pillars of worship and 7 modern principles of leadership. So let's begin with Abel's offering. This is important because it's the first offering mentioned in the Bible. And Abel's sacrifice demonstrates acceptable worship based on faith. And by offering the fat portions of his firstborn lambs, Abel demonstrated that true worship is costly, giving God the best rather than just the leftovers. Next we have Noah's altar. Noah's altar is the first recorded altar in the Bible, signifying the formalization of worship through sacrifice after God's deliverance. Built immediately upon leaving the ark, it highlights gratitude as a primary motivation for worship. It sets a precedent that worship should be the first priority after experiencing God's grace. This act of worship in a newly destroyed world established a lasting covenant and established that communal restorative worship is central to maintaining a relationship with God. Next we come to Abraham's sacrifice of Isaac. This event represents the apex of surrender, moving worship beyond simply offering gifts to the total offering of one's heart and desires. By showing his willingness to surrender his most beloved only son, Abraham exemplified that true worship requires absolute obedience and trust in God's provision. It further acts as a vivid prophetic picture of God the Father, who would later provide the ultimate substitute for sin, his only Son, Jesus. Next we come to the Song of the Sea by Moses and Miriam. Following the exodus from Egypt, this song marks a shift in worship from silent sacrifice to jubilant communal praise, celebrating God as a warrior who fights for his people. It serves as an example of a testimony worship, where the community recounts God's miraculous saving power and judgment of evil. It sets the pattern for future congregational worship that blends remembrance of past faithfulness with future hope. Next we come to the 7 feasts of Israel that were given to Moses. The feasts, or festivals, organized worship into a structural, rhythmic calendar that dictated the spiritual life of the entire community. They connected daily life with prophetic history, forcing the people to pause and recognize God's provision, his atonement, and his dwelling among them. The feasts represent the development of liturgical worship that is scheduled, symbolic, and points directly to the coming work of the Messiah. And next we have the building of the tabernacle and the fire coming from heaven, from the presence of the Lord, and the fire consumed the burnt offering and the fat portions on the altar. And when all the people saw it, they shouted for joy and fell face down. Leviticus 9:24. When the fire fell from heaven to consume the sacrifices at the tabernacle's dedication, it demonstrated God's physical acceptance of Israel's worship. This established that true worship requires divine empowerment and validation, moving it from a human attempt to reach God to a divine human encounter. The presence of fire signified that God dwells in the midst of his people when they obey his sacrificial instructions. Next, the pattern of the tabernacle. The design of the tabernacle came directly from God, who provided Moses with a detailed blueprint or pattern while on Mount Sinai. This divine pattern included specific instructions for the structure, its furnishings, and the priest's garments, which were then executed by craftsmen. The tabernacle layout served as a physical roadmap for worship, representing a step-by-step transition from the common world to the presence of God. Next, we come to the dedication of Solomon's temple. When Solomon finished praying, fire came down from heaven and consumed the burnt offering and the sacrifices, and the glory of the Lord filled the temple, recorded in 2 Chronicles 7:1. The fire served as a supernatural signature. It was God's public way of saying he accepted the building, the king's prayer, and the sacrifices. It proved that the temple was not just a beautiful building, but a holy site. And now we come to the pinnacle of the pillars of worship, and that is the Last Supper. In the Last Supper, Jesus fundamentally altered the progression of worship by replacing the Old Covenant with the New Covenant, the sacrifices of the temple with the giving of his own body and blood. This established the communion, or the Eucharist, as the central ongoing act of Christian worship. Looking back to the cross and forward to his return, it transformed worship from a ritual to an inward relational experience. Next, we come to the day of Pentecost. The arrival of the Holy Spirit on Pentecost moved worship from a ritual practiced before God to a reality practiced in and through the believer. It enabled a new kind of intimate, personal worship. It marked a transition to the age of the church, where believers became the temple of the Holy Spirit and together assembled to build a spiritual temple of worship. Next was the Reformation. The Reformation shifted the focus of worship away from hierarchical ritualistic structures performed by priests back to the Bible and the priesthood of all believers, to focus on salvation by grace alone. It brought worship back into the language of the people and returned preaching to a central place in the service, shifting the focus from the sacrifice of the Mass to the sacrifice of praise and biblical proclamation. Next, the First Great Awakening. The revival that happened in the early 18th century brought a new emotional intensity to worship, emphasizing the need for a personal, heartfelt conversion rather than mere traditional church attendance. It moved worship outdoors and into the public sphere, emphasizing that God could be worshipped passionately and directly by anyone, anywhere, not just in formal church settings. Next came the Second Great Awakening. Building on the First Awakening, this era introduced camp meetings, which further popularized and democratized worship, making it highly accessible to the common person. It fostered a forward-looking revivalist style of worship aimed at personal holiness and evangelism, shaping the enthusiastic experimental style of modern evangelism. Next, at the turn of the 20th century, came the Welsh Revival. This revival introduced a movement where congregational singing and spontaneous prayer took precedence over set liturgies or planned preaching. It emphasized a revival atmosphere where worship was felt to be directly inspired by the Holy Spirit, often lasting for hours, breaking down conventional church service schedules. Shortly after that came the Azusa Street Revival in 1906. It was the catalyst for the modern Pentecostal and charismatic movements, emphasizing the restoration of spiritual gifts as a central part of corporate worship. It broke down racial and social barriers in worship and elevated a highly expressive, experiential, and spirit-led style of praise. And then in the 1960s came the Jesus movement. This movement lasted through the end of the 1970s, and it introduced contemporary music, folk music, and rock styles into Christian worship, adapting a Christian expression to popular culture to reach a new generation. It transformed the aesthetic of worship from formal to casual, and created the praise and worship style that emphasizes intimate vertical singing, shaping how most modern churches worship today. It was fundamental in creating today's Christian music industry. Next, we will look at 7 modern leadership principles. Number 1, the principle of authority. Servant attitude leading with humility. This says, to have God's power and blessing in ministry, we must be under the authority of all those that He has put over us, and we must hold ourselves accountable to them. Jesus is our perfect example, and if it worked for Jesus, then it is right for us. Second is making Christ the foundation. We must have theological soundness. A ministry is not built on a plan, it is built on a person, and that person is Jesus. Before we sit around the boardroom, we need to kneel in the prayer closet. It's hard at first, but it gets sweeter and sweeter. Jesus is the only foundation to build upon. Next, organize and prioritize. Learn the 4 quadrants from the book 7 Habits of Highly Successful People by Stephen Covey. Fourthly, keep the focus. Write out your mission statement and keep it in front of you. Number 5, be proactive. Don't become a victim. Don't be a whiner. Remember, the law of the harvest says to get active. If you don't plant, you won't reap. Number 6, very, very important one, sharpen your saw. You know what it takes for you to stay close to God. And number 7, run to win. Go for the victor's crown. Well, that's the end of our lesson today. I hope it was a blessing to you.